Picture this. You're a CTF box creator working on your latest creation. Maybe for Try Hack Me, maybe for Hack the Box, maybe for some CTF competition. You've planned everything meticulously down to the last detail. It has a cool initial entry point and an even cooler privilege escalation. You publish your box, unleash it on a horde of hackers, watching them struggle for hours. Someone figures out how to get a user shell. They rejoice, but you know they have hours more to go. The PrivEsc uses a novel technique, tricky to detect, even trickier to exploit. It may take them days. Wait, they're root? Already? How? While they're busy celebrating their first blood, you're tearing your hair out. You frantically DM them, asking them how they got root. Oh, it was quite simple, they say. I used a Symlink to... You feel like you could cry. All those hours spent setting up the conditions on the box to be perfect for a specific privilege escalation technique, and it's ruined by the mortal enemy of CTF box creators, the Symlink. Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Tiberius, and this video is inspired by a recent Try Hack Me room called The London Bridge, which I solved using an unintentional PrivEsc that involved, you guessed it, a Symlink. Symlinks are somewhat notorious in CTFs for causing unintentional PrivEscs, likely because their behavior, while well documented, is still a little unusual and can catch box creators off guard. In this video, I'll explain what Symlinks are, how they work, and what CTF creators can do to try and avoid them ruining their challenge. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, and of course leaving a comment to let me know what you thought. Okay, so a symlink or symbolic link is a special type of file which points to another file or even a directory. They are most common on Unix-like operating systems, though some form of them does exist on Windows. However, when it comes to unintentional PrivEscs, Linux symlinks reign supreme. On Linux and other Unix-like systems, symlinks can be created using the ln command with the -s flag, followed by the path to the target file or directory, and then the path to where the symlink should be created. For example, if we wanted to create a symlink to the etc password file within my home directory, we could run ln-s/etc password/home/tiberius/please subscribe. If we run ls-l in the /home/tiberius directory, we can see that the please subscribe file quite literally points to the etc password file, with an arrow being used by ls to indicate the file is a link. If you have colors enabled, the symlink file is also colored differently to regular files and directories, in my case being light blue. Finally, if you look at the file permission string at the very start of the line, you'll see that the symlink file is indicated with an L, as opposed to a dash for a regular file and a D for a directory. You may notice that the rest of the permission string seemingly gives our user, group, and indeed every other user on the OS the ability to read, write, and execute the symlink. If you were thinking this is where the privilege escalation shenanigans come into play, you'd be mistaken. These permissions are a fantasy. They aren't actually real. By convention, symlinks display these permissions, but you cannot read, write, or execute a symlink. When you try to do one of these operations on a symlink, the OS will simply perform the operation on whatever file or directory the symlink is pointing to instead. For example, if we cat the please subscribe symlink, we get the contents of the etc password file. This isn't because my user has read permissions on the symlink, but because my user has read permissions on the etc password file, on account of it being world readable. To demonstrate this, I can try to write to the please subscribe symlink instead, and I get an error because my user doesn't have write permissions to the etc password file. However, if I switch to the root user, I can write data to the symlink because the root user has write permissions to etc password. If the symlink instead pointed at the etc shadow file, my user could neither read nor write to the file, but a root user could perform both actions. You may think that creating a symlink which points to a file your user has absolutely zero access to would be impossible, but it is not. If you know the location of a file, any file, or directory on the system, you can create a symlink to it. On the surface, this doesn't seem like a huge problem, because to do anything malicious to the target files, you still need to have the correct permissions on the files. And if you have those permissions, why not just use them against the files directly? Well, consider for a moment a scenario where you don't have adequate permissions over those files, but you can run some kind of process as a higher level user that allows you to interact with a limited set of files. If you can replace any of those files with a symlink, you can point the symlink at any other file and use the elevated process to interact with it. This is exactly how I solved the London Bridge Try Hack Me room. There is, however, another oddity about symlinks which I haven't mentioned. If you create a symlink to a file which does not exist and write data to the symlink, as long as the user you are writing data as has permission to create the target file, it will be created and the data will be written to it. So here, let me split my terminal and elevate one session to the root user. If I run ls in the /root directory, we can see it's empty. Now, as my low-level user, I'll create a symlink to /root/tiberius.txt, which of course does not exist. If I run ls, we can see that the symlink was created, but the /root directory is still empty. Now, as root, I'm going to echo please subscribe into the symlink. And now if I look in the root directory again, the file is suddenly created with that content. So, to summarize, provided you have write access to some directory, you can create symlinks in that directory. When interacting with a symlink, the only permissions that matter are those of your user and the target of the symlink. Symlinks can be created to point to files or directories which the creator of the symlink has no permissions over. Symlinks can be created to point to files or directories which do not exist. Let's start up the London Bridge over on Try Hack Me and cheese the PrivEsc using Symlinks. Now, I don't want to spoil the box, so I've actually skipped ahead and I have my user shell running as Beth. Again, this PrivEsc is not the correct one, so go ahead and try to find the correct one if you can. However, for some context, there is a web application, and part of the web application allows us to upload files. However, there are some basic file type checking, which meant that we could only upload valid images. Okay, so all these files were uploaded via the application. When we gain a user shell and run ps, we actually notice that there's a web server running as root. Right, it's a Python web server, and this is actually the web application, and it's running out of Beth's home directory. Okay, so here's app.py, and there's the uploads directory. That's where all the files are uploaded to. It's owned by Beth. But if we look inside, actually, let me cd into it. These are all the files that are uploaded, okay, basically all of these, and they are owned by root because the web application is running as root. So any files uploaded via the web application are going to be written to the file system as the root user. But because the uploads directory is owned by Beth, we can actually create files. All right, so we could do touch test, ls-l, and there we go. Test is there. It's owned by Beth. Okay, so we can create files in this directory. So there are a few potential PrivEscs here that we could achieve using symlinks. Since the web server is running as root, we could create a symlink in the uploads directory using our shell and point it to etc shadow, then just access that symlink via the web application. So let's do that now. We're going to do ln-s etc shadow, and we'll call the file shadow. And if we do ls-l, we see we have a shadow symlink pointing to etc shadow. And if we now go back to the web application, if we open one of these files and then find it in the proxy history, so it looks like that's it. Let's just send that to repeater, change this to shadow, and there we go. So we have the contents of the etc shadow file because we read it by this symlink. And there are a few password hashes here, right? So there's the root's password hash, there's Beth's, there's Charles's. We could try cracking these and hope, luck out, but all of these appeared to be quite complex passwords, so cracking wasn't an option. We could also try fishing around for other files, guessing their locations on the file system. For example, maybe root has an IDRSA file in its .ssh directory. We could extract that and then try and SSH in as the root user, but that wasn't possible either. So what actually got me root access in the end was being able to write data to arbitrary files as root. Remember, the web application allows us to upload files, and the files get written using the name provided in the upload form. Okay, so here's the upload request. So that's the name that the file will get written as on the server. In addition, if a file exists with the same name in the uploads directory already, the application simply overwrites that file with whatever contents we provide. So if we choose the correct file, we can create a symlink to it with a name that we can decide, then upload a file with the same name, and because the web server is running as root, we can overwrite any target file on the file system. There is one caveat, however, and that's the file verification step, which requires the files be valid images. You may think this would vastly limit the number of files we could write to, but Linux is actually rather forgiving when it comes to file formats of base files. In fact, it will often simply ignore lines which have an invalid format and read until it finds lines that do. Add to that the fact we can also use the ppm format, which is an interesting image file format that only uses ASCII characters, and the file prefix actually becomes quite small. But to show you what I mean by the file verification check, if I remove the JPEG image header and try and send this, it's going to say uploaded file is not an image. So if you've taken my Linux privilege escalation course, you'll know that the etc password file is rather special when it comes to privilege escalation, as we can actually set hashes for users there, and they'll take precedence over hashes stored in the etc shadow file. We can also create a new user at the end of the etc password file, give them a UID of 0, which effectively makes them an alias for the root user. First things first, let's actually create the symlink to the etc password file. So if I do ln-s etc password, let's call it password, just keep things simple. If I do ls-l, we see we have a password symlink to etc password. Let's actually cat that file, which obviously I can do because etc password is world readable. And let's copy the contents of this file into Burp Suite. I'm just going to delete all of this image data here and paste it there. We'll also add the prefix line. So this is going to make it a valid image. So we're going to call it P6 1 space 1 space 1. That's all you need. And we need to make sure we set this just to password like that, because obviously this name here needs to match whatever we called the symlink. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use open SSL and use the password command, type the word password, all lowercase, password, and it will generate a valid password hash. So what I can do now, if I actually go back here, if I copy this root line and put it at the bottom here, all I need to do is change the root user to something like new root. This could actually be anything you want. I just like calling it new root. And then this X is what we want to replace. We want to replace this X with this password hash that we just generated. So if we do that, this password hash is now going to take precedence over the root user's password hash in the etc shadow file. And actually the new root user doesn't have a password hash in etc shadow, but it effectively works the same way. If we set this as Beth's password hash here, then we could effectively log in as Beth using just the password. And so all we should be able to do now is click send, and it does work, right? We don't get that error. And if we go back to the box, let's cat etc password. And yeah, it looks like we have written to this file, right? So here's the new root user. If I do su new root to switch to this user and then just type the word password, we're logged in. And as you can see, we are in fact logged in as root. And that's because the new root user doesn't really exist. It's just an alias. The UID is still 0, which is the root user, okay? And we can cd into root's directory to prove that, right? And grab the flag. So there we have it, how you can abuse symlinks to find unintentional privilege escalations on CTF boxes. For box creators watching, there are some things you can keep in mind when designing and building your box to minimize the risk of symlinks ruining things. Note that I said minimize the risk. I'm not going to pretend like these are absolute in any way, shape, or form. The first thing you can do is make sure that any services you have running as part of the box abide by the principle of least privilege. That is, if they don't need to run as root, don't run them as root. In the London Bridge box, the web server was running as root when it didn't need to be. Another thing is to ensure that adequate file checks are being performed by any code you have running that does require root privileges. If your code accesses files based on user-controllable input, check that the initial file path references an actual file or directory and not a symlink. If your code creates files, check if the file exists before writing to it, and if it already does, reject the request. Another prevention technique you can use is to make it so that low-privileged users cannot create any kind of file within directories that are important to your box. If at all possible, avoid storing code or binaries in the user's home directory as well, since by default a user can delete any files and empty directories within their home directory, even if they are owned by another user, including root. Finally, if you can, have people playtest your box and ask them to specifically look for unintentional methods of compromise and privilege escalation. It's easy for box creators to become somewhat blinded by their own intended path, and this makes it harder to detect unintentional methods without outside help. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Have you ever found an unintentional PrivEsc using a symlink? Do you have other recommendations for avoiding them when creating a box? Let me know. Until next time, happy hacking!